After my grandfather left me a $44 million fortune, my cheating ex-wife sued to take it. Then the judge read my counterfiling and found her $230,000 secret. The morning I took my seat in Courtroom 14 on the fourth floor of Suffolk County Superior Court in Boston, I was wearing the same gray suit I had worn to my grandfather's funeral. It was not a dramatic gesture. I wore it because I wanted to remember exactly what I was fighting for. Sabrina was already at the plaintiff's table. Her hair was styled for impact, loose waves. Expensive highlights, hours of work, meant to look effortless. Her attorney, Preston Gallagher, whispered something that made her laugh. Then she saw me and performed a slow theatrical eye roll, as if I still did not deserve her attention. I sat beside my attorney, Margaret Ewan, and said nothing. What happened 30 seconds later is the part I want remembered. The Honorable Judge David Fairfield took the bench, organized his papers, and studied the case file. After about 10 seconds, he looked at Sabrina's table, then at mine, then back at the file. "Counsel, I'm confused," he said. "Are these charges filed against Mr. Hartwell, or is Mr. Hartwell the respondent in a counteraction?" Preston Gallagher rose with complete confidence. "Your Honor, my client, Mrs. Hartwell, is the plaintiff. We are seeking equitable distribution of—" "I understand the motion," Judge Fairfield said, cutting him off. He looked at me, then back down. "Mr. Hartwell, I need to make certain I am reading this correctly. The charges of financial misconduct, asset concealment, and fraud are against you," Margaret answered before I could. "They were, Your Honor. We will address each allegation, but more relevant to this morning is the counterfiling my client submitted on Monday." Sabrina's smile remained in place. Gallagher's did not. Judge Fairfield leaned back. "Yes, I see that." He looked from Sabrina to her attorney. "I want to make absolutely certain everyone in this courtroom understands what they walked into today." They did not. That was the point. "My name is Julian Hartwell. I am 43 years old and the Chief Technical Officer of Vantage Systems, a mid-sized cybersecurity firm headquartered in Cambridge, about 4 miles from downtown Boston. We employ 61 people, hold a federal contract with the Department of Defense, and have a reputation I spent 14 years building, through one careful decision after another. Before any of that, I was simply my grandfather's grandson. My grandfather, Raymond Whitfield Hartwell, was 81 when he died on a Thursday morning in late October in the bedroom of his home in Weston, Massachusetts. He had lived there for 43 years. It was the kind of place with a long driveway and quiet old money where wealth did not announce itself from the road. He had started his first company, an industrial supply business, in a garage in Framingham in 1971. By the time I was born, he was already wealthy. By the time I understood what wealth meant, he had become the kind of wealthy people whispered about at funerals. Raymond Hartwell never spent money to prove he had it. He drove a 12-year-old Volvo, wore LL Bean flannel, and grew tomatoes in a raised bed he built himself. He delivered them to neighbors in brown paper bags. He also used the same Weston barber Earl for 30 years and cried outside the shop when Earl retired. He was the most genuine person I have ever known. He was also quietly and without display worth approximately $47 million. Most people never knew the number because he did not live by it. He lived like a lifelong working man who had landed somewhere unexpected. He gave quietly to churches, community groups, and individuals who never learned the source. His accountant compared tracking the donations to documenting rainfall constant and everywhere. My grandfather and I were especially close. My father, his son, was an attorney who spent most of my childhood in his office or on airplanes. My mother tried her best, but ordinary life often overwhelmed her. My grandfather was the steady one. He showed up. He attended my science fairs. He sat in the cold at my high school track meets. When I was accepted to MIT for computer science, he drove to Cambridge, carried boxes with me up 3 flights of stairs, and took me to a diner on Massachusetts Avenue. We ate pie for an hour while he told me stories about the first business deal he had ever negotiated. He was my person. It was that simple. I married Sabrina Kellner when I was 36 and she was 32. We met through friends at an industry event in Boston's Seaport District where she was working as a corporate event planner and I had been sent by an investor. She was sharp, funny, and laughed only when something was truly funny. We dated for 2 years and I thought I knew her. My grandfather met her 3 times before the wedding. After each meeting, he was courteous and careful. He asked how things were going, whether I was happy, and whether I was applying the same standards of judgment to my personal life that I used in business. I thought he was merely being a grandfather. I did not understand what he was trying to tell me until much later. For 4 years, the marriage was fine. It was not the deep partnership I had imagined at our Brooklyn wedding, but it worked. We owned a brownstone on Commonwealth Avenue, traveled twice a year, hosted industry dinner parties, and maintained separate careers, with periods of real warmth. Then, Vantage Systems began doing very well. When we landed the federal contract in the 5th year of our marriage, the scale of everything changed. We hired rapidly expanded operations and entered a level of scrutiny and responsibility that demanded nearly all my attention. I traveled to Washington every other week. I went to San Francisco. I went to Brussels twice in 1 quarter. Eventually, I was everywhere except my own home. I have examined those years honestly. I was not cruel, but I was absent. Consumed by the company, I convinced myself Sabrina understood what this stage required, and that dinners when I was home, plus trips every January and July, were enough to preserve us. I was not paying close enough attention. By the time I recognized the signs, the damage was already done. The signs looked small, alone. Her old warmth became performative. She asked questions without waiting for answers and treated dinner like a checklist. She began going to the gym at odd hours and leaving her phone face down on the kitchen counter. I noticed everything. I cataloged it and waited, because that is what I do. I observe until there is enough information to form a complete picture. The picture came into focus on a Tuesday evening in late March. His name was Derek Caulfield. He was 39, a financial consultant at a firm in Boston's financial district. Sabrina had met him at a client event she organized at a hotel in Back Bay. The affair had already been going on for 3 months before I knew he existed. I discovered it through accidental visibility the way many people do. I returned from a Washington trip one day early after my flight was moved to accommodate a rescheduled meeting. When I entered the house, I heard Sabrina speaking on the phone in the kitchen. I stood in the hallway for about 30 seconds. Her tone was enough. There was a softness in her voice I had not heard directed at me in a long time. She laughed quietly at something, the intimate kind of laugh meant for only one person. 30 seconds told me what I needed to know. I did not confront her. I set down my bag and made enough noise to announce myself. She appeared 30 seconds later with a smile about 3% warmer than necessary. She cooked while I handed her things as usual. Over dinner, she described a double-booked venue and the wrong linens delivered to the Mandarin Oriental. I listened and asked the expected questions. I slept for 6 hours and woke at 4:45 in the morning with the particular clarity that follows a shock before the conscious mind has fully absorbed it. Everything looked cold, precise, and simple. The path forward announced itself without drama. I do not make fast moves in a crisis. I work in cybersecurity. My professional life is built on the principle that information is useful only when it is complete. You do not respond to an incident until you understand its full scope. I applied the same rule to my marriage. For 6 weeks, I gathered information. I was not initially trying to destroy Sabrina, although I understand how naive that may sound after everything that followed. I needed to know the shape of the situation before deciding what to do. I consulted an attorney, organized our financial records, and made sure I understood every document I was reviewing. What I found was larger than an affair. Over 14 months, Sabrina had moved about $230,000 from our joint account into a hidden account. The transfers were small, irregular, and timed to avoid a clear pattern. She placed them near deposits and legitimate household expenses so they would blend in. It was patient, methodical, and obviously planned. I have faced multi-million-dollar federal negotiations, testified before congressional subcommittees, and studied people who were actively deceiving me. None of it prepared me to look across a dinner table and realize my wife had been managing me like an asset. I filed for divorce on a Tuesday morning. Margaret had the papers served at Sabrina's office at 10:15. I was meeting with our Department of Defense liaison when it happened. I know the exact time because Margaret texted me papers served. Her attorney will make contact before the end of business. I finished the meeting and drove to Weston. My grandfather was in his study, sitting in the leather chair that had occupied the room since before I was born. He was reading a book about 19th century New England railroads. He wore a flannel shirt, and his reading glasses rested low on his nose, as they always did when he was absorbed in something. I sat opposite him and told him everything. He listened without interrupting. He had always possessed the rare ability to make another person feel that their words were the only event taking place in the world. When I finished, he remained quiet for a long moment. "I want you to hear something, Julian," he said. "The fact that you built something worth stealing from says more about you than the theft says about her." Then he removed his glasses, folded them, and placed them on the side table. "I've been thinking about some things," he said. "I would like to sit down with my attorney this week. You should probably know that before matters become complicated." I did not ask what he meant. With my grandfather, I had learned to let information arrive at the pace he intended. 7 weeks later, he died peacefully in his own bed, in his own home, exactly as he had always said he wanted. The reading of his will took place on a Monday in December at the office of his attorney, Thomas Connolly, on Newbury Street. My father attended along with my aunt and her husband, a cousin I had seen twice in 10 years, and me. The house was transferred into a preservation trust, with instructions that it remain a private residence rather than be developed. His Volvo went to a nephew. A scholarship fund he had created at UMass Boston received an endowment. Several people were given specific bequests. I did not know most of them, but later learned they were individuals he had quietly helped over the years. His business interest, investment portfolio, and liquid assets, approximately $44 million in total, were left entirely to me. My father said nothing for a long time, then he told me. He said last year that he intended to do this. I just never completely believed him. My aunt asked for a copy of the will. I drove home in silence. I sat in the parking garage beneath my building for 20 minutes before calling Margaret. Sabrina learned about the inheritance before I told her. I still do not know exactly how. The most likely explanation is that someone in Thomas Connolly's office mentioned it to someone else. Boston is smaller than people imagine when lawyers and money occupy the same circles. She called the morning after the will reading. By then, the divorce was already well underway, and we were long past conversations that began with, "We need to talk." That was still how she opened. "I know about the inheritance," she said. "I know you do. I think we should reconsider the divorce proceedings in light of everything." She spoke for about 3 minutes. She described the years we had built together, the idea of partnership, and the support she claimed to have given my career during its difficult early stages. She said the inheritance changed the calculation of what was fair. She used the word equitable twice. She did not mention Derek once. When she finished, I said, "I'll let Margaret know you called." She hung up. The lawsuit arrived 12 days later. On its surface, it was a petition for equitable distribution of marital assets, which was not unusual by itself. But Preston Gallagher constructed the filing around allegations that were fabrications. The core claim was that I had committed financial misconduct during the marriage. Sabrina alleged that I had concealed assets, structured my compensation from Vantage Systems to reduce what she could claim in the divorce, and exerted undue influence over my grandfather during the final months of his life, so he would name me as his primary heir. That last allegation changed something in me. They were suggesting that I had manipulated an 81-year-old man who had spent 60 years sharpening his judgment. A man who saw people in situations more clearly than anyone I had ever known. They were accusing me of manufacturing an outcome my grandfather had mentioned to me himself on the same evening I told him about the divorce. That was when I understood there was no limit to what Sabrina was willing to claim. Margaret's response remained measured. "All right," she said, "we build the counterfiling." What Sabrina did not know, because it had never been relevant to our daily marriage, was the full nature of my position at Vantage Systems. Chief Technical Officer was only the title. When Nate Elgin and I co-founded Vantage 8 years earlier, Nate became CEO and handled clients and external operations. I ran the technical and operational side and held a 54% majority stake. Our Department of Defense contract, now Vantage's largest revenue source, came from an architecture I designed and proposed in a competitive bid. Sabrina knew the company was succeeding, but not my ownership percentage, its valuation, or the details of my compensation. More importantly, she did not know what my grandfather had arranged after our conversation in his study. 6 weeks before his death, Raymond Hartwell revised his estate documents with Thomas Connolly. He made those revisions, knowing my marriage was ending, knowing the financial landscape around me was becoming dangerous, and knowing, with his characteristic foresight, that what he left behind might become a target. The documents included a discretionary trust provision. Under Massachusetts law, the inherited assets were placed in a structure designed to keep them separate from marital property, subject to equitable distribution. I was the sole beneficiary. I had access and control, but the assets remained legally outside the reach of the divorce proceeding. My grandfather knew exactly what he was doing. He had positioned himself 3 steps ahead of a conflict that had not fully materialized. That was who he had always been. The counterfiling Margaret submitted on the Monday before the hearing did not merely deny Sabrina's accusations. It dismantled them, one by one, with evidence. 4 years of audited company financial statements, reviewed and signed by an independent accounting firm, answered the financial misconduct claim. Full disclosure of the trust, together with the legal basis for its classification under Massachusetts probate law, defeated the allegation of asset concealment. The undue influence claim was met with sworn testimony from Thomas Connolly, certified copies of the revised estate documents dated 6 weeks before my grandfather's death, and a letter written in my grandfather's own hand for inclusion in his estate file. In complete sentences, he stated that his decision to leave the estate to me had been made with full awareness, without pressure from anyone, and after decades of considering which members of his family had demonstrated the values he wanted his legacy to support. He had written the letter because he understood that one day it might be needed. I thought about that for a long time. There was one more piece of evidence Gallagher had not anticipated, the $230,000. I had preserved every transfer, cataloged the movements, and hired a forensic accountant to certify the history. On Margaret's advice, I began the divorce without revealing it. The evidence would be used only if Sabrina's side escalated. Sabrina's lawsuit was that escalation. Our counterfiling included the full forensic accounting report, every transfer date, every amount, the destination account, the evidence connecting that account to Sabrina's exclusive control, and the certified conclusions of the forensic accountant. It also included a request that the matter be referred to the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office for criminal review. $230,000 had been deliberately removed from a joint marital account over 14 months without my knowledge. That was no longer simply a divorce dispute. It was potential criminal conduct. On the hearing morning, I woke at 4:53, made coffee, and stood at the window over dark Commonwealth Avenue. Only a delivery truck moved below. Boston before dawn is not silent. Its sounds are simply lowered to a manageable register. I thought about my grandfather, the flannel, the Volvo, the tomatoes in paper bags, the diner, the pie, and his stories. I remembered his calm statement in the study that he had been thinking about some things, a tone that always meant his decision was already made. I thought about the letter in his estate file, the letter explaining that he had chosen me because of what my life had shown him about my values. I felt responsible for being the person he believed I was. I put on the gray suit and drove to the courthouse. After Margaret mentioned the counterfiling, Judge Fairfield spent about 45 seconds reading it. During that time, Preston Gallagher sat completely still. Sabrina kept her back straight and her hands folded. I watched her because I wanted to see the exact moment she understood. "Counsel," the judge said to Gallagher, "I want to be certain I have this right. Your client filed claims of financial misconduct and asset concealment against Mr. Hartwell. Mr. Hartwell's counterfiling includes a forensic accounting review and a referral to the district attorney concerning an alleged systematic unauthorized transfer of joint marital funds." "Your Honor," Gallagher began. "Let me finish." Judge Fairfield looked down again. "The documented amount is significant. The conduct extends across 14 months and the referral has already been submitted. Was your client aware of the forensic accounting before this filing?" There was a pause. My client maintains I did not ask what your client maintains. I asked whether she was aware. The next silence lasted longer. Sabrina leaned toward Gallagher and whispered. He listened, then faced the judge. We were not aware of the specifics of the counterfiling before receiving it. Then I strongly suggest that your client and counsel take a recess to review what has been submitted before we proceed with any of the plaintiff's claims, Judge Fairfield said. Because what I am reading substantially changes the nature of this proceeding. He looked at me. I met his eyes and remained silent. Mr. Hartwell, he continued more quietly, you have also petitioned for full recovery of the transferred funds with interest as part of the divorce settlement. Is that correct? That is correct, Your Honor. He nodded. We will take a 30-minute recess. 30 minutes is a precise amount of time. It is not enough to build a new plan, but it is enough to understand the shape of the problem in front of you. Margaret and I waited in the corridor outside the courtroom. Her calmness was one reason I had chosen her. How do you think they'll respond? I asked. Gallagher is intelligent, she said. He will not push the original claims today. He will request a continuance to review the material. The judge will grant one, but a civil continuance does not pause a criminal referral. That process has already begun. What happens to the trust? The provision is airtight under Massachusetts law. Your grandfather's attorney executed it correctly. The inherited assets are not available for equitable distribution. There is nothing for her to reach. I looked through the corridor window at the gray November sky over Boston's South End. She'll try to stop the criminal inquiry, I said. She will try. Whether she succeeds depends on what the district attorney decides after reviewing our submission. Margaret paused. But Julian, the records are exceptionally clean. The forensic report is thorough. You were careful. I had a good teacher. Your grandfather, he spent 40 years building things carefully. You do not reach $47 million by being sloppy. She almost smiled. When court resumed, Gallagher requested a 60-day continuance. Judge Fairfield granted 30. Then the judge did something I had not expected, and will remember for the rest of my life. He looked directly at Gallagher. Counselor, these are serious allegations. Undue influence upon a decedent's estate is a substantial charge. Before the continued hearing, review everything opposing counsel submitted. Be ready to defend each allegation with specific facts, because I will ask for them. He paused. I have no interest in allowing this court to become a mechanism for harassment during a divorce. I believe you understand me. Gallagher said he did. Judge Fairfield adjourned the session. I stood, straightened my jacket, and picked up my folder. I did not look at Sabrina. I did not need to. Margaret touched my arm. That was a good day, she said quietly. It isn't finished. No, she agreed, but it was a good day. The civil proceeding continued for another 6 weeks. At the second appearance, Gallagher withdrew 2 of the 3 original claims, financial misconduct and asset concealment. The allegation of undue influence was narrowed and then dismissed after Thomas Connolly testified and my grandfather's letter entered the official record. The referral proceeded separately. The district attorney reviewed the materials and opened a formal inquiry. I will not claim an outcome before it is legally determined. I can say the transfers were confirmed and the movement of funds was found to be systematic and deliberate. The divorce settlement was eventually reached without another contested court hearing. With Sabrina's accusations substantially undermined, Gallagher negotiated from a weakened position. The settlement required recovery of the $230,000. My grandfather's estate and the trust he had so carefully constructed remained completely intact. My equity in Vantage Systems was determined to have originated before the marriage and was not divided. I left with what I had brought into the marriage, the value created through 14 years of work and my grandfather's legacy. Sabrina received what the settlement allowed, minus the $230,000, minus her attorney's fees, and subject to the consequences of an inquiry controlled by authorities over whom I had no influence. I later learned through a mutual acquaintance that Derek Caulfield moved to Austin, Texas sometime that spring. Sabrina did not go with him. On the Sunday after the settlement became final, I drove to my grandfather's house in Weston. The Preservation Trust owned it now, but its terms granted me lifetime visiting privileges. I still had a key. I entered through the side door and walked slowly through the rooms. His study remained exactly as he had left it. The leather chair stood beside the lamp he had owned since the 1970s. The shelves were filled with books he had read and annotated in pencil. Through the window, I could see the raised garden bed empty and gray in the late November light. I sat in his chair. I am not religious in any formal sense, but I stayed there for about an hour and spoke to my grandfather. I told him what had happened. I told him that everything he prepared had worked. I told him that his careful, quiet, methodical way of doing things had protected what he built, even after he was gone. I told him I finally understood why he had warned me to use the same judgment in my personal life that I used in business. I told him I believed I was getting better at it. The house was silent. Outside, the November light was low, clean, and unsentimental. I watched the empty garden and thought of tomatoes and paper bags, pie at the diner, and his first negotiation. I thought of his handwritten letter in a Suffolk County court file explaining that he had chosen me because of the values he had seen in my life. I do not know whether that is what justice feels like. I do not know whether there is a clean word for being protected from beyond death by the person you loved most, with the same quiet thoroughness he brought to every part of his life. What I felt was gratitude. Deep, specific, personal gratitude. Not for the money, and not merely for what happened in court, but for the proof that I had been known. Someone had watched how I lived and formed a judgment. The person whose judgment I trusted most had trusted me with his life's work. No court can put a number on that. No settlement can award it or take it away. That is what it means to have been loved by someone who paid attention. My name is Julian Hartwell. I am 43 years old. I am the chief technical officer of a company I helped build from nothing. The heir to a fortune I never expected, and the grandson of a man who drove a 12-year-old Volvo, grew tomatoes for his neighbors, and quietly outmaneuvered everyone who tried to diminish the people he loved. I sat in a Boston courtroom in a gray suit on a November morning and watched a judge read documents my grandfather's attorney had prepared 6 weeks before his death. I watched the people on the other side of the room understand slowly, and then all at once, that they had walked in believing they knew what kind of man I was. They never knew who I really was. They never understood the kind of people I came from. They do now,